With the release of the new Astra Militarum Codex, we received the devastating news that Commissar Yarrick may have finally fallen. I may just be in the first stage of grief, but I couldn't accept that such a prolific character of Warhammer history could be gone. So I decided to arrange some sprues into a pentagram to channel my powers of kitbashing to resurrect this hero of the Imperium. I decided to base my conversion on the new Lord Solar Leontus, giving Yarrick a promotion in the process of resurrecting him. From this kit, all the parts required to build the base model, with the exception of the base details, were removed and cleaned of any mold lines. Probably one of the most iconic details of Yarrick is his giant power claw, liberated from the Orc warlord Uglhard. I sourced this claw from the Meganobs kit. The set contained 3 different variations of claw, so feel free to select whichever you prefer the most. Once clipped from the sprue, the claw was cleaned and assembled. Leontus's left arm is held out in front of him and carrying a sword, which made attaching the power claw that much easier. After a quick comparison, the sword hand was removed. As I wanted to retain the hand, I used my scalpel to carefully cut as close to the glove as possible, giving me a cleaner cut than if I just used clippers. The remaining upper arm was then glued to the torso, and the front of the armour was glued over the top. The power claw already had a cavity that the arm could be inserted into, but the sleeve wasn't quite the right shape. So, a series of trims and comparisons were made to the inside of the claw until the 2 parts could be joined together, at which point I added some glue and made the joint permanent. With the arm in place, my next area of focus were the legs. The right leg would normally feature a pistol holster, but as I wouldn't be attaching it here, I needed to clip away and shave down a small nub. Following this, the strap was also removed, before finally attaching both the legs to the torso. Considering how large the claw is in comparison to the arm, without some additional support, Yarrick would need to have had some ridiculously strong deltoids in order to lift this thing. So, to give him a helping hand, I created a supporting exo arm by repurposing the exo suit from an Orlok Arms Master. It was steadily clipped down and trimmed until it could be placed between the torso armour and the claw. Once I was happy with the placement, the arm support was glued into place. My next task was to pick a head, and for a brief moment, I was extremely tempted to build a Robo Yarrick by using the Servo Commissar from the Ogren kit. But, ultimately, I decided to save that one for a future video. In fact, sorting an ideal head, preferably one in plastic too, was quite tricky. There were initially lots of options, but finding the exact combo of peaked cap and left bionic eye made this much more difficult. Fortunately, the Baneblade Commander head provided me with the perfect option. The new head just needed to be attached to Leontus's raised collar, which saw me first clipping away the head, being careful not to damage the collar itself. Similarly, the ball joint from the Baneblade Commander head was also clipped away and both parts were trimmed back to allow them to fit together. Finally, I glued the neck and the head to the torso. Normally, the Leontus model would wear his sword on his left side, but as I'd removed the sword from the model, having an empty sheath didn't make much sense, so it needed to be clipped away. My aim here was to trim back the sword as much as possible, whilst keeping the fabric below as intact as possible. After gluing the separate piece of fabric to the rest of the leg, further trimming was needed, but once things were a little flatter, the pistol could be glued into place. Normally, the holster would sit on the right side of the model to facilitate a cavalry draw, but placing the holster on the left wasn't completely unreasonable, plus it helped to cover up a few of those trims. With the Yarrick himself built, the mecha horse was assembled, which was done without any additional modifications. With the miniatures built, I could begin work on the base. Leontus comes with a really nice ruined Reaver Titan head, but I decided something a little more orc related would fit the Yarrick theme better. To build up a little height, some torn up pieces of cork floor tiles were stacked and superglued to the base, creating a small rocky mound. Some spare pieces of orc vehicles, specifically from the Death Dread, were then laid around the base. A few adjustments were needed here and there to allow the panels to fit naturally across the rocks, and while I was at it, I also clipped away and flattened the small tabs on the bottom of the horse's feet. With these adjustments made, the panels were glued to the base along with more pieces of cork and plastic. Finally, before I could begin the painting, I decided to create some sub-assemblies to make painting easier. This isn't necessary, but it massively helps things. To make the components easy to hold, several small 1mm holes were drilled into what would be the obscured areas. Into the holes, some 1mm thick wire was superglued to create an ad hoc holder. In addition to this, I also drilled a hole through the base to allow easier attachment to the model later on. With all the loose parts pinned, I was ready to begin painting. I began the painting process by priming everything black. I used an airbrush for this, along with some of Vallejo's black primer. But an airbrush isn't necessary here. This primer would create a much better surface to paint onto, and also help to create shading in the recesses. While I still had my airbrush to hand, I also decided to make my first base coat a little easier by spraying the first base coat colour across the areas of the model that would remain black. The paint I chose for this was Cold Corpse Blue, and like the rest of this guide's paints, was sourced from the Tooth and Coats range. This was lightly sprayed onto the raised areas of the horse's armour and Yarrick's clothing. Again, the airbrush isn't entirely necessary though. You could just skip the step entirely and keep those areas as the base black primer. From here, everything else was done with my regular brush. To start off, I tackled all the base coats first, and these were all approached in the same way. I took my paint, Berserker Red in this case, applied it to my palette and thinned it out with a little water. When applied across the model, this slightly watered down mix would allow easier coverage. Plus, after allowing it to dry and applying a second coat, it would result in a much smoother finish. This first base coat saw me tackling all of the red areas, which included the lining of the cloak, the hat, the claw, and the sash. Continuing with the base coats, I next painted the leather details using some Scorched Earth. These areas included Yarrick's boots, belt, and holster, as well as the horse's reins. For the areas that would ultimately be white, such as Yarrick's cuirass and the horse's mechanical legs, I began with a base coat of Wizard Grey. The remaining areas of the horse and Yarrick's gloves were then given a base coat of Dust Bowl, which brought me to the metallics. These were approached in the exact same way, starting with some Surcoat Silver for all of the areas of steel, followed up by some Spartan Bronze, which would form the basis of all of the gold details. With the metallic base coats complete, I changed my paint water to prevent metallic flakes from making their way into my subsequent layers of paint. The final base coat was to be applied to the face, and for this, I opted to use Barbarian Brawn. With the base colours all blocked in, I could now begin the process of bringing out the details with a series of layers and highlights. The first of these layers was created using some Cold Corpse Blue, which was thinned out with even more water than the previous base coats. About 3 parts water to 1 part paint will create an extremely translucent mixture that can be steadily layered up over the surface. These multiple layers can be used to build up transitions and gradients from darker recesses to the lighter raised details. In this case, I use my glazes to build upon the Cold Corpse Blue that I applied earlier with my airbrush. Using the same method as before, I next use a glaze of the Wolf Grey to further lighten the raised details. I narrowed my areas of coverage here and focused only the paint application more towards the upper parts of the model, areas that you'd expect to be brighter under a natural light source. Finally, the black areas of the model were finished off with an edge highlight of Gravestone Blue. Applying a fine line of this extremely pale bluish grey helped to complete the gradients that were built up in the previous steps, whilst also sharpening the hard edges. Once again, this process was repeated across the other areas of the model, beginning with the red areas. I started off with a glaze of Sanguine Scarlet, followed by an edge highlight of Demon Red, and finally an extreme highlight of Fanatic Orange. Rather than lining all of the edges with this paint, I focused predominantly on the corners where 2 edges converged. This helped to create the appearance of sharpness, further enhancing those details. While the base coats were quite dark already, there were a few areas that I wanted to deepen the recesses a little further, particularly across the metallic details. Using some Battle Mud wash, I coated both the gold details and the steel areas across the claw. Once the wash had dried, the highlights could continue. For the gold detailing, I began with Dragon's Gold, and finished off with a Glistening Gold extreme highlight. In a similar fashion to the gold details, the remaining steel areas were first washed with Oblivion Black Wash, before being highlighted with Plate Armour. And finally, an extreme highlight of Mythril Blade. Once again, I made sure to change out my paint water once the metallics were complete. From here, I could return to the non-metallics, with the first of these being the leather areas. A glaze of Ancient Forest was applied to start off with, followed by a highlight of Wasteland Brown. The white areas of the model were started off with Carcharodon Grey, before being highlighted with some White Star. The tan areas were given an initial glaze of Sandstone, and then highlighted first with Templestone. The tan areas were then completed by applying an extreme highlight of Vampire Fang. Which brought me to the skin. It was first given a glaze of Dwarven Skin to help bring out some of the facial features. But, in order to emphasize some of those recesses, I decided to give the skin a layer of flesh wash. The wash is a little too strong straight from the bottle though, so I diluted it with just a little water first. Once the wash had dried, I could return to the highlights by picking out all of the facial features using some Elven Skin. To help give the face a little extra detail, I then added a tiny amount of Demon Red as a glaze to the lips and around the eyes. By adding a little extra colour and variation in the skin tones, it's just helped to prevent the skin from looking flat and unnatural. Continuing with the Demon Red, I then used it to pick out Yarrick's Bale Eye and the cybernetic eye of the horse. And finished off with a highlight of Orange Flare, finishing off Yarrick and his mount. The next areas to tackle were the details on the bases, which were simply painted in the same way that I painted the black armour, white armour and tan details. With the details completed, the rocks on the base needed a little colour and texture added to them. I settled on a desert-like surface, and to create this I used some of AK Interactive's Dry Ground Texture Paste. This was layered across the entire base, which helped to add a little extra colour and texture. However, great care was taken not to overspill onto some of the details. In order to bring out some of the coarse texture and to darken down the recesses in the rocks, I applied a wash of Battle Mud Wash. Like with the earlier Flesh Wash, mixing in a little water here will massively help to improve its flow and ensure that the wash gets into all of those nooks and crannies. After the wash had been allowed to dry, the gritty texture was picked out with a series of dry brush using increasingly lighter tans. I began with a light layer of Vampire Fang, and finally some Ivory Tusk to pick out the very edges of the larger rocks. To give the impression of dust building up in the recesses of the debris, I took a little more Vampire Fang and heavily thinned it out with water to create a wash. This was applied in and around the details. Once dry, it would simulate the appearance of accumulated dust and debris. And with that, the model was very nearly completed. All that was left to do now was to clean up the rim of the base with a layer of Doom Death Black, which is followed up with a matte varnish to seal in and protect the paintwork whilst removing any remaining glossiness. Finally, I just needed to remove the wires, scrape the contact points clean and glue the loose parts into place, which left me with this. And here we have the completed Lord Solar Yarrick. Now, even though this wasn't a particularly complex conversion, I think the miniature has achieved that iconic Yarrick look. While I could have simply used parts from the old miniature, as it's no longer in production, I felt that sticking to parts from more current kits would make this result much more replicable. So if you have any more ideas for old models you'd like to see me resurrect in a future video, then let me know in the comments below. For those of you looking to recreate this miniature and colour scheme, I'll include all the kits and paints used in this guide in the description below, along with some affiliates links to where you can pick them up for yourself. But before I go, let me say a big thank you to the ever wonderful patrons who keep this channel going, especially my expert tier and above supporters who are Big Tom, Jonathan Hart, Maciej Savitsky, Tim, Brushlicker Nim, Daniel Dowling, Joachim Falk, Jonathan Sandsteed, Casper Limborg, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Pale Juice, Svedsman, and the Googles. If you're interested in supporting me too, you can find a link to my Patreon below, where supporters can get ad-free access to my videos, sneak peeks, a private Discord channel, and exclusive merchandise. Plus, you'll be helping me out in the process. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.